a welcome into their chambers. Dear friends, I want you to come with me tonight on a journey. Together, we'll step into the world of Victorian servant women whose lives were shaped by conditions most of us can barely imagine. These remarkable individuals endured hardships that history has largely hidden away, managing their bodies and their dignity through methods that would shock us today. The reality of their existence stood in stark contrast to the graceful image that the Victorians wanted to project to the world. Before we begin, I genuinely appreciate if you take a moment to like this video. If what you find here resonates with you, please subscribe as well. In the comment section, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Knowing who joins us from across the globe makes this experience feel shared, and that matters deeply to me. Now, I invite you to prepare yourself. Dim your lights if you can. Perhaps turn on a fan to create that gentle, soothing background noise that helps us settle into quieter spaces. As we embark on this exploration together, I want you to know that we're about to witness something rarely acknowledged. We're going to walk beside these women and see the secret routines they could never admit to anyone, the practices they performed in darkness and in silence. The servants' quarters existed as a completely different world from the rooms upstairs where the families lived. If someone had stepped into these spaces before the household awakened, they would have encountered an atmosphere shaped entirely by shadows and a heavy, deliberate silence. This was not peaceful quiet. This was the kind of silence born from exhaustion, from the brief pause that came before labor consumed another day entirely. The air in these spaces carried remnants of the night before. It held the coolness that hadn't yet been pushed away by morning activity. The faint scent of ash lingered from the previous day's fires. Damp cloth hung where it had been hastily dried. The worn stone floors, cracked and uneven from decades of footsteps, bore witness to the endless cycle of work that defined these women's lives. In that dim space, where morning light barely penetrated, the truth of how servant women maintained any semblance of cleanliness became evident. Everything they did started with gestures so subtle they almost vanished into the background of their daily chores. A hand might slip into the fold of a tattered apron pocket. A thumb would brush against fabric that had been stitched unevenly during repairs done by candlelight. Eyes would dart toward the narrow hallway, listening intently for any approaching footsteps that might signal discovery. Within these pockets and beneath these aprons lay the smallest fragments of something these women were never supposed to possess: soap. That single word carried weight in a Victorian household. The bars of soap provided to the servants were measured, counted, and controlled with a precision that revealed far more about the anxieties of the Victorian world than any written rule could capture. Soap represented cost. It symbolized fuel. Most significantly, it was considered far too valuable to give to the hands that scrubbed the floors and blackened the grates. To understand the desperation of a maid situation regarding soap, one must grasp how the Victorian household viewed these essential items. To place a full bar into the hands of a servant woman was seen not as providing her with something necessary, but as committing waste or indulging in an inappropriate luxury. The only soap she was permitted to handle belonged to the tasks assigned to her by the household. What she used for her own body had to be obtained through other means, carved secretly from a larger bar, with a knife made dull from years of use. She would shape these fragments with meticulous care, shaving them into slivers so thin they could be tucked into the seams of her clothing without creating any telltale bulges. Sometimes she would break pieces off and create small crumbs that would disappear among the folds of cloth that made up her uniform. These pieces were always softer than proper bars, having been handled too often, worn into irregular shapes that bore the marks of her desperate ingenuity. They carried the faint scent of lye and something sharper underneath, the unmistakable smell of fear, because each sliver represented something explicitly forbidden. Discovery could cost her the position she depended upon to survive. The morning hours were safest for using these stolen fragments. During this time, while the rest of the household still slept, the rooms awaited their daily restoration. The boundaries between cleaning the house and cleaning oneself blurred just enough for a determined servant to take advantage of the opportunity. A quick wash of hands in a bucket that was technically meant for the stairs could pass unnoticed if performed with practiced precision. A brief moment spent wiping under the arms while scrubbing the scullery table seemed like part of the normal rhythm of work. The trick was to keep all movements small and to maintain an expression that suggested her intentions were entirely invisible even as she was carrying them out. Water splashing too loudly could raise immediate suspicion. Suds clinging to her skin could betray her activities in seconds. The soap itself had to be hidden again before it softened too much, wrapped quickly in a scrap of cloth, and placed back into the warmth of her apron, where no one would think to look for contraband. It was not merely the theft of an object that posed a threat to her position and safety. The deeper transgression was the theft of dignity that was supposedly being denied to her anyway. Soap was classified as a household resource in the Victorian mind, not as a personal right or necessity for anyone below stairs. Using it for one's own body meant deliberately overstepping the invisible boundary that separated servant from property. If a woman was caught with her own fragment of soap, the accusations would follow quickly. She would be blamed for dishonesty, for showing disrespect toward the household's regulations, or for wasting resources that were too valuable for such purposes. More frightening still, she could simply be dismissed without reason, without explanation, without a reference for future employment. The fear of that consequence hung constantly over every small act of personal cleansing, transforming something as basic as hygiene into a form of private rebellion that was made of chalky crumbs and whispered routines that had to be performed in haste. The secrecy itself shaped their habits in fundamental ways. These women learned to wash themselves quickly, taking care to avoid any visible sign that their skin had ever touched warm water. They learned to fold their aprons in very specific ways that would conceal any added weight or bulk. They learned to mend the pockets of these aprons with such subtlety that even the head housemaid would overlook them during the inspections that happened regularly. There was something almost heart-wrenching about the way these soap fragments represented something more than just cleanliness. They embodied hope. The Victorian world placed enormous emphasis on surface cleanliness as a mark of moral character and virtue. Yet the very people who maintained that appearance, the servants who worked tirelessly to create that illusion, were systematically denied the tools they needed to care for their own bodies. The physical reality Of deprivation, servant women could feel the residue of soot clinging stubbornly to their fingers long after they had finished their work. They smelled the sweat that had dried into the seams of their sleeves, creating a persistent odor that no amount of surface washing could fully eliminate. They understood with absolute clarity that without some hidden method of keeping themselves clean, the discomfort would inevitably progress. Discomfort would turn into soreness. Soreness would develop into infection, and infection could end their ability to work. A few seconds of actual washing, real washing with soap and warm water, could ease what hours of labor had caused. But those seconds had to be stolen like treasures, guarded with the same care that a wealthy person might guard jewels. The desire to feel clean, even for just a brief moment, represented one of the few comforts these women could offer themselves in a life that was structured entirely around meeting the needs of others. The soap crumbs also carried the weight of constant risk. Inspections by the mistress or other household staff happened at unpredictable moments. A mistress might pass through the kitchen at precisely the wrong moment and notice damp hands, or the faint smell of lye soap. A butler checking the supplies could question why a particular bar seemed smaller than it had yesterday. Even other servants, particularly those who harbored ambitions of rising in position within the household hierarchy, might report suspicious behavior in exchange for favor from their superiors. The pressure to remain invisible extended even to matters of hygiene, as though the bodies of servants were not meant to have needs. It was easy to imagine the tension that filled those early mornings. Each movement was rehearsed and practiced. Each stolen moment was threaded carefully between the constant demands of the household. Even when a servant succeeded in washing herself, the relief lasted only minutes before the day consumed her completely again. The heat from the cooking stoves, the soot from the fireplaces that needed constant attention, and the sweat from carrying heavy loads of coal would all cling to her skin by the middle of the day. Yet the memory of those soap slivers, hidden and forbidden and absolutely essential to her sense of self, followed her through every corridor she scrubbed and every staircase she climbed. They were a constant reminder of how fragile her control over her own comfort truly was, and how much effort went into preserving even the smallest sense of personal dignity within a system designed to strip it away. The bar of soap and its gleaming privilege. The bar of soap that sat on the mistress's washstand gleamed with privilege and abundance. It was full, fragrant, and untouched by rationing. The servant's crumbs, by contrast, dissolved slowly in secret spaces, leaving behind only the faintest scent of something clean in a world that offered her none. These stolen fragments of soap revealed the profound desperation and the quiet struggle for personal cleanliness that could exist in the lives of Victorian servant women. But the routines that shaped their mornings were only the beginning. The lengths to which these women went to protect their own bodies from neglect ran far deeper than we might initially imagine. What came afterward would deepen the secrecy significantly, as some women washed their faces with leftover water that had been meant for infants, and wiped themselves dry with kitchen cloths that still carried the lingering smell of last night's meals. The quiet hours of early morning offered servant women the only moments when they could tend to their own needs. Even those brief moments were shaped entirely by secrecy and the constant awareness that discovery could bring consequences. Long before the household stirred, long before footsteps sounded in the upper rooms, the scullery held bowls and basins that had been left to rest from the previous day's work. Each of these vessels carried the cloudy remains of tasks that never truly ended. Among these various containers was the basin that had been used to wash cloths for the children, or perhaps to rinse small garments belonging to the family. It held a mixture of lukewarm water and faint traces of soap, barely strong enough to lift grime from fabric. The water was never meant for the servants themselves, yet it became one of the few resources available for whatever small care they could give to their own bodies. What should have been discarded as waste became a kind of lifeline, a genuine chance to remove a night's worth of sweat and soot before the world began demanding their labor once again. The water was never clean. Thin threads of cloth floated near the surface, drifting aimlessly. Specks of dust clung to the edges of the basin, a reminder of the dust that seemed to settle everywhere in a busy household. Still, the sight of that water brought a quiet kind of relief, a moment of gratitude for whatever small comfort could be found. For a servant woman whose days were completely controlled by the needs of others, even a few drops of leftover water could feel like possession, like something that belonged to her, at least for a moment. She would approach it with caution, listening carefully for any sound from the passageway that might signal another worker entering the room. She watched the flicker of a lantern that would indicate someone approaching in the darkness. Only when the stillness had settled around her again could she bend toward the basin, cupping her hands just enough to hold the remnants of warmth that had not yet vanished from the previous day. The act of washing her face became an intricate exercise in invisibility, a dance of movements designed to leave no trace. The morning light that filtered through the narrow window made certain angles of the scullery unsafe, so she learned to shield herself from it, positioning her body to stay hidden. One hand lifted instinctively to block the light, turning her into nothing more than a silhouette pressed against the wall. The shadow she created became a small refuge, a dark corner where her movements could be mistaken for ordinary cleaning work, if anyone were to glance in her direction. She brought the water to her face slowly, allowing it to loosen the grit that clung to her skin after a night spent in narrow beds that she shared with too many other bodies, in spaces with too little fresh air circulating through them. The coolness of the water was brief but profoundly grounding. It washed away the heaviness that came with sleep and eased the deep ache that another day of labor was about to inflict on her body. Yet each moment of this ritual carried its own tension, its own risk. The water left streaks on her cheeks that she had to dry quickly, before anyone could see them and ask questions. The skin beneath her eyes sometimes grew raw if she rubbed too hard in her haste to complete the ritual. Her fingers trembled slightly from the fear of being discovered in such an act, because even washing her face could be interpreted by the household as using resources improperly, as overstepping her place. She learned to move with absolute precision, shaping her gestures so carefully that they looked like they were simply part of her assigned duties, nothing more. The drying cloth had to be chosen with great care, something that was already stained and frayed, something that no one in the household would miss if it went unnoticed for a moment. It was often a kitchen rag that had been abandoned at the end of the previous night, stiff from the heat of the day and the grease from cooking. She pressed it to her skin gently, folding it to hide the dampness, then returned it to its place as though it had never been touched, as though her hands had never even come near it. The distorted reflection, the entire ritual never lasted longer than a breath or two, a handful of heartbeats before she had to return to her duties. She was acutely aware of the rules that governed her life, the regulations that cared meticulously for the cleanliness of the house itself, but showed complete indifference to the cleanliness of those who maintained it. Her face would glow for only a moment after she washed it, but that moment mattered more than anyone could understand. It was a reminder that she had not disappeared entirely into her role as a servant. It allowed her to carry a small sense of self, a fragment of her own identity, into the long hours ahead. Those hours would be filled with scrubbing stone, hauling coal that left her hands blackened, polishing silver until it gleamed, and answering the quiet demands of people who rarely looked her in the eyes, who seemed to look right through her as though she were merely another piece of the household machinery. Her reflection in the basin was distorted and rippling with every movement she made. She rarely saw herself clearly, and perhaps that was part of the reason why this brief cleansing felt so necessary to her emotional survival. The Victorian ideals praised purity, order, and refinement with almost religious fervor. Yet these ideals did not extend to the women who worked tirelessly to support them. Servant women lived in the margins of these ideals, expected to present tidy, neat appearances without ever being granted access to the means that would allow them to maintain those appearances. The act of washing a face with water that had been cast aside after washing children's garments revealed the profound contradiction at the very heart of the world they served. Cleanliness was presented as a symbol of virtue, yet the people required to uphold that symbol were left to manage with whatever scraps they could salvage from the discards of the household. The leftover water carried a faint scent of soap, barely detectable unless one was paying close attention, but enough to suggest to a sensitive nose what proper cleanliness might have felt like. That hint alone could stir longing, a quiet desire for a different kind of life, one in which washing oneself was not a forbidden act that had to be performed in secrecy, one in which care for one's own body was considered a right rather than a transgression. Yet such longing had to remain hidden behind an expression of dutiful acceptance. Everything about their bodies had to remain hidden. A servant woman learned early on that the household valued her hands only for their usefulness and service, never for their comfort or for her own care. The stolen wash and the blurred boundaries. Each drop of water she used drew a thin line between survival and suspicion, between maintaining herself and risking her position in the household. As she stepped away from the basin, the dampness gradually fading from her skin, she carried with her the evidence of a brief victory. It was one small act of self-preservation that the household would never acknowledge, would never consider, would never support. The morning routine resumed around her, continuing as though nothing had occurred, as though she had not just performed a small act of rebellion. Yet her body remembered the coolness of the water and the moment of quiet it had given her. The stolen wash from a child's basin shows how even the simplest act of caring for one's face became a secret within the rigid structure of Victorian service. The quiet theft of cleanliness formed only a fragment of the hidden routines these women crafted to endure their difficult days. Very soon, the struggle would move beyond the face entirely, revealing how they created makeshift mouthwashes from kitchen ingredients just to keep themselves presentable to the household above. The morning kitchen and its hidden remedies. Mornings inside a Victorian kitchen carried a mixture of heat and damp air, along with the lingering sense of yesterday's work still present in every corner. This was a space where servant women moved with quiet purpose long before anyone upstairs had begun to stir. The weight of the air, thick and heavy, made the kitchen feel like a separate world entirely. Within that atmosphere lay countless objects meant to serve the household's needs. Remarkably, almost nothing existed that was meant for the women themselves. Even the simplest effort to maintain personal cleanliness had to be crafted from the scraps of daily labor, shaped by the constant awareness of secrecy and guided by the knowledge that the kitchen was never truly empty, never truly safe for any act of self-care. Among the few possibilities available to these determined women, one stood out for its sharpness and for its absolute necessity. It was a method born not from any desire for luxury, but from the fundamental need to mask the breath that was left sour by sleepless nights and constant strain. The process began with a bottle of vinegar resting on a shelf. To the casual observer, this was unremarkable, just another ingredient in a working kitchen. But to the women who depended on it, the vinegar held quiet promise. Vinegar was used for cooking, for preserving food that needed to last through the seasons, for lifting stubborn stains from cloth that had become discolored, and for cleaning pots that had been blackened by constant exposure to heat. Its presence in the kitchen was routine, absolutely ordinary. But the women had learned that this very routine could be turned to their advantage in ways the household never intended. The sour breath and the sharp mixture, they filled a small cup with water drawn from a basin, water that was cloudy and cool from sitting overnight. To this water, they added just enough vinegar to create a thin mixture that stung the nose. Sometimes a pinch of coarse salt was dropped in to strengthen the effect and make the mixture more powerful. The combination was harsh, almost painfully so, but harshness mattered far less than the need to feel clean, to feel like they had some control over their own bodies. Their mouths carried the residue of long days spent speaking only when spoken to, of breathing fumes that rose from the stoves, and of eating little and eating quickly. A sour breath could lead to reprimands from the mistress or the housekeeper, or to judgments about personal failings and lack of discipline. The mixture served as both shield and survival mechanism, allowing them to move through their days with a small measure of confidence. The act itself required a level of precision that could not afford to falter. A servant woman waited for the exact moment when the kitchen buzz softened, when footsteps faded away into hallways and corridors, and the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. This moment rarely lasted long, but it was enough. It was always enough. She reached for a small spoon, usually worn smooth from years of stirring broths and sauces, and dipped it carefully into the mixture. The metal touched her lips, cold and sharp, before she tipped her head slightly to let the liquid roll across her tongue and toward the back of her throat. The taste was immediate and overwhelming, filling her mouth with a burning tang that pushed away the stale bitterness left by sleep and hours of uninterrupted work. She did not swallow. Instead, she allowed the liquid to sit just long enough in her mouth to accomplish what she needed it to do, then leaned over the basin to let it fall quietly against the side, so the sound would not echo through the quiet kitchen and attract unwanted attention. The sensation was uncomfortable, unpleasant even, but discomfort was familiar to her by now. The sting of small victories. The vinegar left her mouth tingling, numbing the edges of her tongue and tightening the inside of her cheeks. Yet, with that sting came a feeling of control, a potent reminder that she could still manage small parts of her life, despite the extensive demands of the household that claimed nearly all of her time and energy. She moved quickly to finish the ritual, wiping her mouth with the edge of her sleeve or a scrap of cloth that had already been used for some other household duty. The fabric held faint traces of grease or dust, but she pressed it firmly against her lips, careful not to leave any sign behind that would betray what she had just done. A clean cloth could not be used, for that would draw unwanted attention from those watching her carefully. Every detail mattered in ways that people living above stairs could never understand. The position of her body while she bent over the basin, the way she placed the spoon back among the others in the drawer, the steadiness of her breathing as she listened intently for someone entering the room, all of this had to be controlled. Even a moment of hesitation could reveal too much about what she had been doing. It was not the act of using vinegar that would condemn her, but the implication that she had taken something for her own benefit without permission, that she had dared to care for herself in a household dedicated to the principle that servants existed only to serve. Her appearance had to remain neutral and functional, free of any suggestion that she tended to herself as carefully as she tended to the needs of the family she served. The memory of the vinegar's sting followed her through the morning, lingering on her tongue as she moved from room to room, preparing fires, dusting surfaces, or carrying trays up the narrow back stairs. It served as a reminder that small efforts mattered, that within the rigid structure of service there remained fragments of autonomy carved out in hidden minutes, moments she had claimed for herself. The sharpness gradually fading in her mouth felt like proof that she had preserved a piece of herself before the day demanded her complete attention. It gave her the confidence to speak when necessary, to answer instructions without fear of being judged for something as simple as breath gone stale from exhaustion and overwork. Tools of survival vinegar became for many servant women one of the few tools they could rely on consistently. It did not soften the ache in their feet or ease the stiffness that developed in their hands from cold water and constant work, but it made them feel briefly renewed in a world that left little room for any kind of renewal or rest. The harsh mixture also symbolized the contradictions that shaped their lives entirely. They prepared elegant meals for the families they served, setting polished tables and arranging delicate dishes with care, yet they could not count on having a single clean drop of water set aside for their own comfort. They washed silver until it gleamed and shined, yet rinsed their own mouths with a liquid better suited to scrubbing pans and removing stubborn stains. The divide between the lives upstairs and the lives downstairs could be tasted in every drop of that vinegar mixture, and still the act continued day after day because the alternative, letting neglect show in the smallest ways, felt even more dangerous to their positions. Their roles required invisibility, But that invisibility could never include imperfection. They were expected to appear neat, composed, and odorless, standards that demanded constant attention without ever granting the means to meet them openly. The vinegar mixture, unsettling as it was, allowed them to navigate those expectations with a quiet resilience that rarely received any acknowledgement from those they served. This sharp and hidden routine reveals how something as simple as fresh breath required secrecy and considerable discomfort in the world of Victorian service. The struggle to remain presentable pushed them into methods that bordered on desperation. The hair and the fingers. What came afterward reached even deeper into necessity, as some women learned to tame their tangled hair using nothing more than their fingers when proper combs were forbidden to them. The earliest moments of a servant woman's day often revealed the full weight of the restrictions placed upon her, and nowhere was this more visible than in the simple act of tending to her hair. The narrow rooms where she slept were usually dim and crowded, offering little more than a shared bed or a hard cot that was pressed against cold walls that never seemed to warm. When she woke, her hair carried the imprint of restless nights, flattened in some places and tangled in others, shaped by the dampness in the air and the constant exhaustion that never truly left her body. Her scalp itched from days without proper washing. Yet this was a part of herself she had to manage quietly, for the household provided no tools for her own grooming. Combs and brushes belonged only to the family upstairs or to the housekeeper, items controlled as carefully as any valuable, locked away or counted to prevent misuse. What remained for her were her hands, the first and last tools she could truly rely on. She learned to use her fingers with the same precision she used to polish silver or scrub floors, until they gleamed. Each strand of hair became something she coaxed gently apart while listening for footsteps that signaled it was time to begin her workday. Her nails served as makeshift teeth, catching knots and pulling them loose with small movements practiced over years of repetition until the motions became second nature. The process was slow and often quite painful. The tangles resisted her efforts stubbornly, tugging at her scalp until her eyes watered from the discomfort. Yet she continued, because leaving her hair unkempt could draw reprimands or questions that no servant wished to face. A woman's appearance mattered deeply within the household, even if her comfort did not matter at all. The fragment of a comb. In that contradiction, she found ways to adapt and survive. Her fingers, though cracked from cold water and harsh soap, moved with a familiarity that a proper comb might never have given her. She knew the pattern of her own scalp, the places where knots formed most stubbornly, and the gentle pressure needed to ease them without causing injury. On mornings when her hair was especially tangled and difficult to manage, she would search for something more substantial than her own fingers. Occasionally, broken comb teeth appeared in the servants' hall, discarded after a proper comb had cracked under use or aged beyond repair. These fragments were small and jagged, barely long enough to grasp comfortably, yet to her they represented opportunity and possibility. She wrapped the pointed end in cloth to keep it from cutting her fingers, then drew it carefully through her hair, using it as a makeshift tool. The motion resembled the use of a real comb, though it required considerably more effort and offered less reward. Still, she held on to these fragments like treasures, treating them as if they were precious jewels. They were tools she was never meant to have. Tools salvaged from what the household threw away, from discards that were never intended for use below stairs. She kept them hidden in the seams of her uniform or beneath a loose floorboard, retrieving them only when she had enough privacy to use them safely. The deeper truth of bodies. The secrecy of grooming reflected a deeper truth about the servant woman's existence. Her body existed within strict boundaries defined by the household. She was expected to remain unobtrusive, neat, and compliant with every rule, no matter how unreasonable. But the household rarely acknowledged how much effort it genuinely took to maintain those expectations. Her hair absorbed the smells of the kitchen, the smoke from the fireplaces that needed constant tending, and the heat from the laundry room. Throughout the day, strands came loose as she bent, lifted, scrubbed, and carried heavy loads. Yet each morning had to begin with the same quiet ritual of restoring some semblance of order. It was a routine born not of vanity, but of absolute necessity, a way of grounding herself before a day that asked her to disappear behind her tasks. Her fingers grew more skillful with time, learning to separate strands without breaking them, smoothing curls or flattening waves, so that her appearance would not raise unwanted attention from those who observed her constantly. When the other servants hurried past her in the cramped hallways, they performed the same motions, each woman aware that this hidden ritual was shared among them, part of their collective survival strategy. Their hair might differ in texture or length, but their circumstances were identical. They lived in a world where their personal needs were afterthoughts overshadowed by the demands of their employers. Grooming became an act of resilience, a small assertion that their bodies mattered even when their roles suggested otherwise. As she prepared for the day, she tucked stray strands behind her ears, adjusted her cap or bonnet carefully, and smoothed the front of her hair one final time. The ritual ended not because she was fully satisfied, but because the household required her attention elsewhere. Work always began before she was ready. She stepped into the corridors carrying the memory of her fingers moving through her hair, a reminder that even in the smallest acts, she preserved pieces of herself. The knots and the constraints. The knots she had untangled reflected the larger constraints she lived under, yet she continued to face them with a steady determination shaped by years of practice. This quiet struggle to groom her hair shows how necessity shaped every aspect of a servant woman's life, forcing her to rely on whatever tools she could create with her own hands. The effort to appear orderly masked a deeper truth about their constant improvisation and adaptation. What came next pushed this resourcefulness even further. Some women turned to the ashes of the kitchen hearth to cleanse their scalps, when proper washing was entirely forbidden to them. There were mornings when the heaviness of a servant woman's hair revealed more than mere fatigue, long hours near the stove, the constant warmth of the laundry room, and the sweat that formed under tightly pinned caps left her scalp coated with oil that no proper wash could address. Water, warm water especially, was not an option available to her. Wet hair would betray her immediately, raising questions she could not afford to answer or explain away. The ash and the scalp. The household controlled every heated kettle and every basin of clean water, and any sign that she had used even a cup for herself could result in punishment or immediate dismissal. In that world of restrictions, she learned to search for what no one else valued, The materials that gathered quietly in the corners of the kitchen and hearth, waiting to be swept away and discarded. Dry ash became something far more than waste in her careful hands. It became a secret answer to a need she was never allowed to speak of openly. The ash collected beneath the grate held a fine texture, soft enough to cling to her fingertips when she tested it, yet coarse enough to bind to the oil trapped at her roots and throughout her hair. She waited for a moment when the kitchen fell silent, when the others had stepped out to fetch coal or carry dishes upstairs to the dining room. Only then would she kneel near the hearth, sliding her hand beneath the iron frame to gather a small handful of the pale powder. It took practice to choose the right ash. Pieces that were too large would scratch her scalp painfully, while pieces too fine would disperse in the air before settling into her hair where she needed it. She sifted the powder gently, letting bits fall through her fingers until only the softest layer remained in her cupped palm. Carrying the ash was a risk in itself, significant and constant. She could not let it spill on her apron where it might create a telltale mark, nor could she hold it openly in her palm where someone might see. Instead, she cupped her hand discreetly, moving down the corridor with steps measured carefully to avoid stirring a cloud of dust that might betray her. The refuge in shadows. She often retreated to a corner of the yard or a narrow passageway where the light was weak and the air carried the faint smell of morning frost. The quiet of these spaces became her refuge, a place where she could tend to herself without being observed or questioned. She lifted her hand and pressed the ash to her scalp, working it through her hair with slow and deliberate movements that showed care. The sensation was strange at first, unfamiliar and slightly uncomfortable. The powder felt cool against her skin, dry enough to absorb the oils that had built up over days of labor without rest. She rubbed it gently along her scalp, feeling the gritty texture as it threaded through her strands. Little by little, the ash dulled the shine of sweat and softened the heaviness that clung to her hair. It did not smell pleasant, not at all, but it carried the faint scent of smoke and warmth, a reminder of the work that defined her days. The powder settled into the layers of her hair, binding to what she wanted to remove, clinging to the pieces of herself she could not scrub clean in any other way. Once the ash had done its work, she lowered her head and shook it free. The motion had to be controlled so the dust would disperse without leaving traces on the ground that others could notice and question. The wind helped when she stood near an open door, sending the powder drifting into the air where it blended with the natural dust of the morning. When she used the backyard, she aimed for the patches of soil already darkened by footprints and coal, allowing the powder to vanish into the earth. The small transformation. With each shake, her hair felt lighter and less burdened, a small transformation achieved without water or tools. Afterwards, she smoothed her hands along the sides of her head, checking for any remaining patches of ash that might be visible. Sometimes, she used a cloth to brush away the last traces, but most mornings, she relied solely on her fingers and the natural movement of her hair. The routine was never perfect. A faint dryness lingered in her hair, and she knew it would never feel as clean as the hair of the mistresses upstairs who bathed with scented oils and warm water, drawn by the very hands that were now dusted with ash. Yet even this coarse method offered relief, real and tangible relief. It restored a degree of comfort that allowed her to move through the day without feeling weighed down by her own body and the burden of dirt. The act carried its own quiet symbolism, deeply meaningful, even if no one else understood. She was surrounded by objects meant for others, by tools and comforts she could never fully access. And so she learned to craft her own solutions from what the household discarded, transforming waste into necessity. Ash became a reminder of her resilience, a material transformed by desperation and necessity into something practical. It reflected the greater truth of her life. In a world where she was given almost nothing for herself, she learned to make something out of nearly anything. Her hair, once heavy and dull, lifted slightly as though acknowledging her effort, small though it was. The secrecy of this ritual remained essential to her survival. A stray smudge of ash on her collar could bring questions she had no intention of answering. A scattering of powder on the floor could lead to accusations of carelessness, or worse, accusations that she was wasting resources. She carried out every step with the precision of someone who understood that even the smallest misstep could ripple through her day and create problems. She knew the household's rhythms as intimately as she knew her own reflection, and she used that knowledge to find moments that were hers alone. As she returned to her duties, the faint softness of her hair became a reminder that she had claimed a rare act of care for herself. It was not a luxury. It was not even comfort in the true sense. But it was enough to keep her moving through the day, with a body slightly less burdened and a spirit slightly less dulled. Night and the icy water. The dry powder beneath her nails reminded her of the length she had learned to go to preserve a semblance of dignity. This hidden cleansing with ash reveals how necessity drove servant women to reshape the debris of the household into tools for their own survival. The struggle to maintain even basic comfort pushed them into rituals shaped by secrecy and endurance. The ordeal that lay ahead grew even more intimate and exhausting. Many women waited until the coldest hours of the night to wash their undergarments in icy water that numbed their hands and threatened their place in the household. Night inside a Victorian household carried a different kind of silence, one shaped by exhaustion rather than by peace or rest. The servants' quarters quieted only after every dish had been scrubbed, every floor dried, and every fire reduced to embers that glowed softly in the darkness. By the time the last chore faded into stillness, most women had only a few moments before sleep claimed them completely. Yet some needs could not wait for morning, and among these was the quiet ritual of washing the garments closest to their skin. Undergarments were never spoken of openly, yet they absorbed the hardest truths of long days spent bending over grates, hauling laundry, and moving quickly between rooms where heat and cold clashed without mercy. The burden of silence proper washing of such clothing required privacy, something rare and fleeting, which forced servant women to turn to the coldest hours of the night for a task that the household did not acknowledge as part of their burden. The water they used was rarely clean or warm. Most nights, the only source available came from a bucket left outside the back door, filled with rainwater that had been gathered throughout the day. The bucket sat beside the wall of the yard, exposed to dust carried by the wind and to soot drifting from nearby chimneys. It was cold enough to sting the skin, even in warmer seasons, but it was a resource that belonged to no one in particular, and therefore it belonged to them. A servant woman would step into the yard quietly, her breath clouding in the night air, listening carefully to ensure that no door opened behind her. She moved with the caution of someone used to living between the edges of permission, aware that even necessity could be interpreted as disobedience. The garment she carried was often small, folded tightly so no one could see the wear and discoloration that marked a day's labor. She dipped it into the cold water and felt her fingers stiffen almost immediately. The cloth absorbed the chill until it grew heavy, pulling against her hands as she rubbed it between her palms. Stains from sweat and ash clung stubbornly, requiring a determination that the cold made difficult. Yet she continued, knowing that leaving the garment unwashed could draw comments from the housekeeper or provoke looks from the other servants that suggested judgment. The impossible standards. The standards of cleanliness imposed upon them did not include allowances for the lack of time, warmth, or privacy required to meet those standards. The night carried its own risks. A lantern from an upper window might flicker unexpectedly. A coachman crossing the yard could raise questions she could not answer. Even the sound of fabric being wrung out might draw attention in the wrong moment. Still she pressed on, twisting the cloth to force out the water, feeling her knuckles ache from the pressure. The rhythm of washing became a kind of quiet endurance, a reminder that caring for herself had to be squeezed into the narrowest spaces of her life. Once the washing was done, the greater challenge began. Drying the garment required a source of warmth, yet open flames or visible heat were watched closely by those in authority. The household reserved the comfort of warm, drying racks for its own needs, leaving the servants to find their own solutions. Many women turned to the kitchen stove, slipping the damp cloth into the back of the warming space, where ashes still radiated faint heat. The placement had to be precise, calculated carefully. Too close, and the fabric risked scorching from exposure to direct heat. Too far, and the cloth would remain damp by morning. She worked quickly, tucking the garment into the narrow corner where shadows concealed it, relying on the dying warmth of the oven to finish what the night's cold water had started. The fear of discovery lingered with every movement, a constant companion to her task. The housekeeper often inspected linens in the early hours, checking for smells or dampness as signs of improper washing. If she found a servant's personal garment hidden among the tools of the kitchen, the consequences could be severe. An explanation had to be ready, and one stood above the rest. The excuse and the distinction. A servant woman learned to say that she had been washing a hand towel, using the excuse with a tone of humility that concealed her dread. The distinction between a garment for the household and one for her own body mattered far more to the hierarchy above her than it did to the cold truth of her nightly labor. When the garment finally dried, usually close to dawn, she retrieved it with relief so quiet it barely registered in her expression. The cloth was stiff and carried the faint scent of smoke, but it was clean enough to face another day. She folded it carefully and slipped it into her small drawer, all beneath her pillow, hiding the evidence of a routine that consumed more energy than anyone upstairs would ever understand. The cold in her fingers lingered long after she left the kitchen, a reminder of the length she had gone simply to maintain a basic sense of cleanliness. These nightly washings revealed the invisible burden placed upon women whose bodies worked constantly and rested rarely. To the household, garments appeared on their bodies each morning without thought to how they came to be there. Yet each piece of clothing carried the effort of survival stitched into every fiber. The silence that accompanied these rituals shaped their days as much as the labor itself. Washing her undergarments in icy darkness reveals how even the most essential acts demanded secrecy and sacrifice in a world that denied her basic comfort. What she endured through those hidden nights only deepened her resourcefulness as she tried to protect her dignity in small, fragile ways. Soon her struggle would reach into the very air around her, driving her to craft makeshift perfumes from dried leaves and wilted flowers to disguise the odor that constant labor etched into her skin. The fragrance and its politics. Fragrance inside a Victorian household was a privilege carefully guarded, a subtle marker of status that drifted through hallways and clung to the fabrics of the women who lived upstairs. For servant women, however, their own scent was something they were expected to erase rather than enhance, and the tools to do so were rarely within reach. Long hours near smoke, sweat soaked into uniforms that could not be changed or properly cleaned, and the constant grind of work left odor they could not hide without consequence. Cleanliness mattered deeply to those in authority, yet they were denied the means to achieve it openly. This contradiction pushed them toward quiet ingenuity, using whatever nature offered them to create small solutions that hovered at the edge of acceptability. Scent became not a luxury, but a shield, a necessary defense against judgment and gossip. The kitchen yard often provided the raw materials these women needed. In the planting season, small sprigs of mint or lavender grew along the edges of the garden, usually intended for cooking or for placing in drawers upstairs to freshen linens and clothing. Servant women gathered these leaves and flowers only when no one noticed, selecting those that had already fallen or those too small to be missed. They carried them back inside, tucking them into aprons or slipping them between folded cloths. The fragrance was faint at first, barely detectable beneath the smells of the kitchen, but it offered hope. The days of drying. They laid the herbs on a warm windowsill or near the stove to dry, watching the petals curl and the color fade until what remained was concentrated scent, trapped within brittle leaves. Creating the mixture required patience measured in days, not moments. At night, when the household slept, a servant woman filled a small cup or jar with water taken from whatever source she could manage. Into this water she placed the dried petals or crushed leaves, submerging them until they softened again, releasing the faint sweetness that had survived the drying process. The infusion grew slowly, taking on the pale tint of lavender or the bright sharpness of mint. She stirred the mixture gently with the tip of a worn spoon, careful not to leave any sign of her efforts on the kitchen table. The jar was then hidden away, sometimes behind pots, sometimes beneath the lowest shelf where only dust gathered. Over the next few days, the fragrance deepened as the water absorbed the last whisper of the plant's life. When the mixture reached its strongest point, she used it with caution that bordered on reverence. A few drops were enough. She dipped a fingertip or the corner of a cloth into the scented water and touched it lightly to her clothing. The inside of a sleeve or the edge of a collar became the quiet carriers of this fragrance. The scent never lasted long. It faded as she worked, swallowed by heat and movement. But for a brief moment each morning, it softened the harsh reality of the day ahead. It reminded her that she still had a body worth tending, even if the world she served refused to acknowledge that truth. Yet this ritual carried danger, significant danger. The household mistress often wore perfumes imported from afar, delicate blends created by professionals in far-off cities. The hierarchy of scent, any hint that a servant carried a similar scent, even one so faint it barely reached the air, could be seen as insolence or presumption. Comparison, even accidental, was forbidden. Servant women learned to choose herbs whose smells were humble, subtle, impossible to mistake for the polished fragrances upstairs. Mint was considered safe, lavender safer still, but anything with sweetness risked questions and accusations. The boundaries of scent mirrored the boundaries of their roles entirely. The fragrance that rose above its place threatened the hierarchy that shaped every corner of the house. The resourcefulness involved in crafting these small perfumes reflected a larger truth about their lives completely. They were expected to maintain appearances, yet given only remnants to work with. Their hair had to be tidy without proper combs, their hands clean without warm water, and their clothing fresh without time or soap. The scented mixtures they created allowed them to walk through the house with a quiet confidence, a sense that at least one aspect of their presence remained under their own control. It was not about beauty. It was about dignity. It was about resisting the erosion of self that constant labor threatened. These perfumes also served as emotional anchors. In the midst of orders barked across rooms, the clatter of dishes, and the weight of endless scrubbing, the faint scent rising from a sleeve could bring a moment of calm and centeredness. It reminded them of gardens, of open air, of moments free from the strict rules of the household. Sometimes the scent was the only pleasant sensation they experienced in an entire day. The fact that it came from their own hands, crafted in secrecy and with intention, made it all the more powerful. Thus, the act of creating fragrance from dried leaves and fading flowers became a testament to resilience. It showed that even within the oppressive structure of service, servant women carved out spaces where their humanity could breathe and be nourished. They learned to transform the smallest materials into a lifeline, shaping invisibility into quiet strength. Crafting these hidden scents reveals how even the air around them became something they fought to reclaim in a world that denied them comfort. Their efforts to soften their presence grew more inventive as their needs became harder to hide. The teeth and the harsh remedies. Ahead lay an even harsher reality, where some women were forced to clean their teeth with nothing more than coarse salt or traces of ash, scraping away discomfort with methods that left their mouths burning long after the morning chores began. Morning inside a Victorian household began long before sunlight reached the narrow windows of the servants' quarters. And in that dimness, personal care had to be shaped out of whatever materials were available. A servant woman's mouth often carried the sourness of sleepless nights, the residue of hurried meals, and the dryness left by hours spent breathing in dust and smoke from the kitchen fires. Proper dental care was a privilege reserved for those upstairs where soft cloths, scented powders, and imported brushes adorned polished wash stands. Downstairs, the scarcity of tools forced women to rely on the simplest substances drawn from the same supplies used for cooking and cleaning. Salt and ash, harsh and unrefined, became the only means they had to keep their mouths clean enough to avoid scrutiny from those in authority. The coarse salt used in the kitchen sat in heavy crocks near the hearth, its crystals sharp enough to sting the skin if touched too long. A servant woman approached it carefully, waiting for a moment when the kitchen fell into one of its rare silences. She dipped her fingertips into the salt, gathering just enough to coat her index finger. The motion had to be discreet, careful, deliberate. A handful of salt taken for personal use could be questioned, even considered waste. She pressed her finger to her teeth, feeling the burns spread as the salt scraped across the enamel. The sensation was both painful and grounding, a reminder that every part of her life required endurance. The struggle against judgment as she worked, grains dissolved against her tongue, leaving a bitterness that lingered long after she finished. This makeshift method did little to mask the discomfort, but it removed what it could. Salt stripped away the film left by nighttime breathing, lifted food particles from the crevices of her teeth, and left her mouth feeling slightly cleaner, though never truly refreshed. The taste grew sharper as she moved from tooth to tooth, and she often paused to spit into a bucket or rag, taking care to avoid leaving any trace that might reveal she had used kitchen supplies for herself. Every movement was shaped by fear of discovery, as though tending to her own hygiene represented some breach of her place within the household. For some women, salt was too scarce to risk using regularly, especially in homes where the mistress kept strict inventory. In such places, ash from the fireplace became the alternative. After cleaning the grate, the woman sifted the remnants carefully, separating the coarse pieces from the soft, powdery ash that still held faint warmth. She pressed the powder between her fingers, checking its texture, ensuring no sharp fragments remained. Ash carried a dryness that clung to moisture instantly, and when applied to the teeth, it bound to oils and residues that salt sometimes missed. She rubbed the ash against her gums, feeling its fine grit working into the spaces between her teeth. The taste was unpleasant, bitter and smoky, yet it offered something salt could not. It gave her a sense of quiet renewal, a feeling that she had used the last traces of one day's labor to prepare herself for the next. These methods, though simple, were not without risk. The abrasiveness of salt could wear away at her enamel, and ash could irritate sensitive gums. The invisible costs, but the consequences of neglecting her teeth were far more immediate in the eyes of her employers. Any hint of foul breath could lead to reprimands or accusations of uncleanliness, and repeated complaints could endanger her position. The household demanded that she remain invisible in her scent, her appearance, and even her voice. Maintaining that invisibility required constant effort, and these small rituals became an essential part of her survival. What made the practice more difficult was the absence of privacy. She lived and worked in spaces designed for function, not comfort. The kitchen bustled with activity at dawn, the scullery filled with clatter and steam, and the corridors echoed with the footsteps of workers moving quickly to prepare the house. To find a moment for herself, she had to rise before the others or steal seconds between tasks. Her body angled away from view, her hands moving swiftly to avoid detection. Her mouth, though small compared to the endless chores she completed daily, held the most intimate proof of her humanity. Caring for it required secrecy, not because the act was shameful, but because acknowledging her needs disrupted the structure that kept her labor constant and unquestioned. She rinsed her mouth with a sip of leftover water, careful not to swallow the bitterness she had just scrubbed free. The cold liquid washed away the final traces of ash or salt, leaving her teeth feeling smoother than before. She wiped her lips with the corner of her sleeve, pressing the fabric lightly so that the dampness would not show. By the time the household began to stir, her mouth was prepared to speak the first polite responses required of her, though her tongue still tingled from the harshness of the routine. These improvised dental rituals revealed the deeper truth of her life completely. Every ordinary need had to be built from scraps shaped by ingenuity and carried out in silence. Comfort was never granted. It had to be crafted from whatever remained at the edges of the household's wealth. Her body, though essential to the functioning of the home, was treated as something secondary, cared for only through resourcefulness and quiet defiance. Warmth and the kitchen cloth, scrubbing her teeth with salt or ash, shows how even the smallest moments of self-care demanded resilience in a world that gave her nothing freely. Each grain and each scrap became a tool for survival as she moved through her days under constant judgment. Beyond this struggle awaited yet another hidden routine, where she turned to stained and fraying kitchen cloths to wipe her body clean in the brief moments before the household awakened. Warmth inside a Victorian kitchen was often the only comfort a servant woman felt in an entire day, and even that warmth came not from rest, but from the heat of constant labor. By the time the household finished its evening meal, the kitchen held a soft, fading glow from the stoves, along with fragments of warmth in the water used for washing pans and utensils. It was in these brief minutes between duties that a servant woman searched for ways to care for her body without drawing attention. Evening was not a time meant for her to rest or relax, yet she learned to shape it into one, gathering the remnants of the day and turning them into tools for survival. Among these tools, the worn kitchen cloths offered the closest thing she had to a bath. The clothes themselves bore the history of the household, stained from hours of wiping spills, streaked by food scraps, and worn thin in the center from endless scrubbing. They hung on hooks near the fireplace to dry. No one looked at them twice. Their frayed edges and faded stripes made them invisible in the eyes of the household, which made them valuable to the women who worked downstairs. After the dishes were stacked and the floor swept, she moved toward the cloths casually, as if preparing for another round of cleaning. Only when the kitchen door remained still and the last footsteps faded up the stairs did she allow herself to take one down. The water she needed was not fresh, but it was still warm enough to soften the chill that clung to her skin. It pulled from the bottom of the basin where vegetables had been rinsed or where plates had been quickly washed. She dipped the cloth into the shallow warmth, watching it grow heavy as it absorbed what remained. The scent of the day's meals clung to the water, mixing with the smokiness of the cloth itself. None of it mattered, really. It was the only warmth available, and she used it carefully, squeezing it just enough so that droplets did not fall and betray her intent. She slipped the damp cloth under her sleeves, wiping the skin from wrist to elbow, lifting away the film of sweat and soot that had gathered during the day. The sensation was neither refreshing nor pleasant. It was merely necessary, what she needed to do to maintain herself. The cloth rasped lightly against her skin, tracing the path where flour dust had settled or where grease from the kitchen had clung. She worked quickly, knowing she had only minutes before someone might enter. Each pass of the cloth brought a small relief, a sense of having reclaimed a part of herself, hidden beneath layers of labor. Her underarms required the most attention. The heat of the kitchen and the weight of her uniform trapped moisture, leaving a sharp odor she had learned to fear. A complaint from the mistress or the housekeeper could mean reprimand or worse. She slid the cloth upward, pressing it firmly to erase what she could, praying the faint warmth would disguise the effort rather than reveal it. The fabric absorbed sweat and soot, but left behind a faint residue of the meals cooked that evening. She ignored it. Cleanliness for her was not perfection. It was an attempt, a fragile defense against judgment. Once she had wiped as much as she dared, she returned the cloth to its original place. This step mattered more than any other. The cloth had to hang exactly as it had before, its corner folded the same way, its dampness unnoticed among the other drying linens. If the housekeeper suspected that a cloth had been used improperly, punishment could follow swiftly. A servant woman's needs were not meant to be visible. They existed outside the rules of the household, tolerated only as long as they left no trace. So she smoothed the cloth carefully, aligning it with the others, letting the warmth of the stove dry the evidence of her brief ritual. As she stepped away, her skin felt only slightly cleaner, but the change mattered. It allowed her to face the next morning without the fear of being judged for odor she could not control. It restored a sliver of dignity, a momentary sense of being more than the work she performed. Her body, though exhausted and marked by the day's tasks, felt a little lighter, as if the cloth had not only lifted dirt, but also the weight of being overlooked. This small act of washing with a kitchen cloth revealed the stark truth about her life. Everything she needed came to her only in fragments. Warmth arrived from leftover water. Cleanliness came from rags meant for wiping dishes. Privacy existed only in seconds, stolen from the rhythm of the household. Yet she shaped these fragments into her own survival, crafting moments of care from the waste and wear of the home she served. Cleansing herself with a stained kitchen cloth shows how even comfort had to be stitched together from scraps in a world that denied her basic dignity. Each hidden ritual bound her more tightly to the shifting boundaries of secrecy and necessity. Ahead waited an even harsher method of self-maintenance, where she scraped hardened skin from her heels, using nothing more than a coarse stone hidden near the firewood. Early morning in the servants' quarters carried a silence unlike any other hour of the day, a silence shaped not by rest, but by the brief pause before labor began. In that thin space of time, a servant woman confronted the needs she could not acknowledge once the household awakened. Among these needs was the removal of underarm hair, a detail considered trivial by those who enjoyed private dressing rooms and polished mirrors, but deeply consequential for the women who worked below. Sweat gathered quickly beneath heavy uniforms, and any hint of odor could bring reprimand sharp enough to threaten her position. With no access to razors or proper grooming tools, she was left to devise methods that balanced necessity with concealment. One of the most extreme involved fire itself. The kitchen hearth offered the only consistent flame within reach, its embers glowing faintly even before dawn. She approached it cautiously, knowing that any unusual movement at this hour could draw unwanted attention. From the pile of kindling, she selected a thin piece of wood, one that could burn quickly and brightly without crumbling. She held it near the embers until the tip glowed red, sending up a faint curl of smoke. The sight alone carried a sense of danger. Fire was a tool of the household, but only when used for its intended purpose. Turning it toward her own body was forbidden, yet it was the only method she had to remove hair without leaving evidence behind. She stepped away from the hearth, positioning herself near the darkest corner of the kitchen, where shadows absorbed the light. Raising her arm, she brought the glowing tip close to her underarm, careful not to let it touch the skin directly. The heat singed the hair, curling it away from her body. The scent of burning drifted upward, sharp and animal-like, and she held her breath as she worked. Every second mattered. One heartbeat too long, and the heat could blister her skin or leave a mark that she could not hide. But she had practiced this many times, learning to measure distance by instinct, judging when the hair had weakened enough to be removed. Once the strands had shriveled slightly, she set the wood aside and used her fingers to pull the hair free. The motion was abrupt, a quick tug that left her eyes watering and her breath unsteady. The pain was sharp but fleeting, a familiar sting she had learned to accept. Pain was a small price compared to the humiliation of being told she smelled unclean. The household judged her silently with every passing glance, and keeping her body in order was not an indulgence. It was protection. The risk extended beyond burns. Smoke clung easily to fabric, and the faintest trace of it could betray her actions. She fanned the air gently, pushing the smell toward the chimney, then pressed her sleeve against her skin to check for residue. Her uniform carried scents from cooking and scrubbing, and for this reason she often performed the ritual before fully dressing. Even then, the smell of singed hair threatened to linger. She wiped the underarm with a damp corner of her undershift, praying the scent would fade before anyone descended into the kitchen. Each movement had to be precise. She returned the kindling to the pile casually, arranging it so no one would notice a piece slightly charred at the end. Embers shifted softly in the hearth, swallowing her tracks. By the time the first footsteps of the household echoed in the hallway above, her arms hung at her sides as though she had done nothing more than prepare for morning duties. Her skin still tingled from the heat, and faint redness marked the place where hair had once grown, but she was ready for inspection, ready to move through the day without fear of scrutiny. This method, though crude, reflected how deeply resourcefulness had shaped her life. She used fire not for comfort, but for erasure, removing any hint of herself that might be judged excessive or improper. Her body was expected to be silent, odorless, efficient, and contained. The responsibility for achieving this fell entirely upon her, even though she lacked the tools considered essential by those who lived above. The glowing embers became a strange ally, offering her a moment of control in a world otherwise designed to deny it. Yet the danger never faded. A single misstep could leave a scar that no one would forgive or ignore. Fire had to be negotiated carefully, treated with respect, fear, and necessity. Each time she performed the ritual, she confronted the fragility of her position, the knowledge that her survival depended on using the household's own elements against themselves without ever revealing the struggle. Even so, she continued, for a servant woman, grooming was not vanity. It was a silent ritual of self-preservation, a way of holding on to dignity despite a life that tried to strip it away. The heat, the pain, the secrecy, all became threads woven into her mornings, shaping the boundary between being tolerated and being condemned. Burning away unwanted hair with a glowing ember exposes how even basic grooming demanded danger, stealth, and endurance in her hidden world. Each small ritual pulled her further into methods shaped by necessity rather than choice. Soon, she would confront the roughness of her own feet, scraping hardened skin from her heels with a coarse stone hidden among the firewood, a task that left them raw, yet still expected to carry her through another day of relentless labor. Night settled unevenly across the servants' quarters, bringing not rest, but a quieter kind of labor, one directed toward the body rather than the household. A servant woman moved through these hours with a familiarity shaped by exhaustion, knowing that her feet, which had carried her through endless tasks, now demanded their own attention. The floors she scrubbed, the stairs she climbed, the stones of the yard she crossed day after day left the skin of her heels thickened, cracked, and aching. No one cared for this discomfort. It was expected, even considered natural, for her body to bear the weight of toil without protest. Yet she understood that if the pain grew too severe, she would falter, and faltering was not allowed. So she crafted a ritual to keep her feet strong enough to survive the days ahead. The yard behind the kitchen offered the materials she needed. Scattered near the edges of the path were small stones smoothed by rain and time. She chose them carefully, selecting those with just enough grain to wear down rough skin without tearing it. These stones looked ordinary, indistinguishable from the rest, and that was their value. They could be taken without notice, slipped into the folds of her apron, or hidden beneath a pile of laundry. Once inside, she concealed them in places few bothered to examine, such as the depths of a firewood bin or the dark corner beneath a shelf. Their hiding places reflected her life. Useful things had to be kept out of sight to survive. Her nightly ritual began only after the kitchen fell silent. She filled a basin with cold water, using whatever remained from the evening's chores. The water numbed her fingers as she lowered her feet into it, the shock of the temperature spreading up her legs. Yet the cold eased the swelling gathered during the day, loosening the tightness that wrapped her muscles. She sat with her back against the wall, absorbing the stillness around her. There was no luxury in this moment, no softness, only a brief pause in which she could reclaim a part of her body that work had worn thin. When her skin had softened slightly in the chill, she reached for the stone. The first pass along her heel brought a mixture of relief and discomfort. The grain of the stone pressed against hardened skin, lifting small flakes away. She moved slowly, careful not to press too hard. Breaking the skin would lead to infection, and infection could end her ability to work. Her feet were her foundation, the literal support for every task she performed. Losing their strength was unthinkable, so she scraped gently, listening to the subtle sound of the stone moving across her heel, feeling the pressure ease with each stroke. The process required patience. She shifted her foot, rotating it to reach the outer edge, where calluses formed most aggressively. The stone warmed slightly in her hand as she worked, its surface damp from the water and softened skin. She repeated the motion on the other foot, knowing that even the smallest difference in pressure would be felt the next morning when she hurried across the kitchen in the cold dawn. Her goal was not beauty or smoothness. It was survival. She was shaving away the pain, that threatened to slow her down, carving out a little more endurance from a body already pushed beyond its limits. When she finished, she dipped her feet back into the basin, letting the water wash away the loosened skin. The sensation of cold returned sharply, biting at her freshly exposed layers, but she welcomed it. Clean skin, even when raw, felt like a small victory. She dried her feet with the edge of her shift, working quickly to avoid leaving damp traces that could be questioned later. Her movements were quiet, practiced, shaped by the constant need to avoid notice. Hiding the stone again was just as important as using it. She wiped it carefully and returned it to its hiding place among the firewood or beneath the lowest step of the back staircase. No one would think to look for it there. Stones blended into the disorder of working spaces. Tools meant for her own care had to remain invisible, for the household preferred to believe that servants needed nothing beyond discipline and endurance. Her private rituals contradicted this belief, so secrecy guarded them as tightly as necessity demanded. Once her feet were clean and the stone hidden away, she stood slowly, testing her balance. The ache had softened, replaced by a dull soreness she knew would fade by morning. The act of tending to her feet, though small, steadied her. It reminded her that her body, worn as it was, still belonged to her in these moments. The world above might deny her comfort, but she could build it from fragments, shaping care out of stone, cold water, and silence. This nightly task revealed the truth of her existence entirely. Everything she needed had to be carved out of the margins of the household, reclaimed from materials never meant for her. Her survival depended not only on strength, but on the ingenuity that allowed her to transform the smallest objects into lifelines. Scraping away hardened skin with a stolen stone shows how even the ground she walked on became part of her struggle to stay capable in a place that consumed her strength. Each night, she rebuilt her endurance through rituals shaped entirely by necessity. Before long, she would risk far greater harm, lifting steaming water from the tea kettle to wash her hair in secret, knowing that a single drop too hot could burn her scalp, but that arriving to work with unkempt hair could threaten her standing in the household. Morning, in the servants' quarters, unfolded in a rush of footsteps, clattering dishes, and the tense quiet that settled before the household awoke. In this narrow slice of time, a servant woman had to complete not only the first tasks of the day, but also the personal care that she could not safely perform later. Her hair, heavy with the smoke of the kitchen and the sweat of restless nights, required attention far more often than the rules of the house allowed. Clean hair was expected of her, yet she was rarely given the means to wash it. Warm water belonged to the household upstairs, and permission to use it was granted only for assigned chores. So she learned to rely on the scraps left behind, especially the thin layer of hot water remaining at the bottom of the morning tea kettle. The kettle itself held a kind of quiet promise. After water was boiled for tea, a small amount clung to the metal, still steaming, but unwanted by those who moved through the kitchen with authority. She lifted it carefully, testing the temperature with a cautious touch along the spout. The water was hot enough to soften the oil and grime in her hair, yet dangerous if poured too quickly. Balancing the kettle in her hands, she searched for a corner where she would not be seen and where the light fell gently enough to hide her movements. Each step was chosen with precision, her ears tuned to every sound in the hallway above. She placed a basin on the floor and tilted the kettle slowly, letting the water spread across the bottom in a shallow pool. Steam rose in delicate threads, brushing against her face. She dipped her fingertips into the water, feeling for a temperature she could withstand. Sometimes the heat bit into her skin, forcing her to wait until it cooled. Other times, the water lost warmth too quickly, reducing its effect, but she learned to judge the moment, to act at the precise point between danger and usefulness. Leaning over the basin, she cupped her hands and lifted the water to her scalp. The warmth loosened the oil at the roots, and she massaged it into her hair with swift, practiced strokes. Her hair absorbed the heat greedily, the strands pulling apart as she worked her fingers through them. The scent of the tea leaves lingered faintly, mingling with the smoke from the hearth. She repeated the process until the basin held more residue than water, each handful carrying away another layer of the previous day's labor. Time pressed against her. Footsteps from above could begin at any moment, and she had only minutes to complete the ritual. She lifted the basin and poured the remaining water slowly over the back of her head, letting it run down the length of her hair in narrow streams. The sensation was both cleansing and startling, a warmth that vanished into the cold air almost immediately. Droplets clung to her skin, sliding down her neck and disappearing beneath the fabric of her shift. She worked swiftly, squeezing out as much water as her hands could manage. Her hair never fully dried in these moments, but she could reduce the dampness enough to hide it. To finish, she reached for a scrap of cloth, often a torn piece of an old apron or a frayed edge of a kitchen towel. The fabric was rough, not meant for such use, yet it absorbed water quickly. She pressed it gently along her scalp, drawing out the last of the heat. Then she wrapped a headscarf tightly around her hair, covering any dampness that might betray her. The scarf also protected her from the morning drafts that swept through the kitchen and served as an excuse should anyone question her appearance. A covered head was practical, ordinary, unremarkable, exactly what she needed. Despite the harshness of the method, these moments carried a quiet sense of renewal. Clean hair, even if only briefly clean, allowed her to move through the household with a confidence she rarely felt. It softened the sense of being worn down by the constant proximity to heat, smoke, and labor. Yet the ritual remained fraught with risk. A single misstep could leave her scalp burned or her hair damaged. A moment's delay could lead to discovery, and discovery meant punishment for misusing household resources. Every drop of hot water belonged to someone else, and she borrowed it only in secrecy, shaping her survival from what others discarded. Still, she repeated the ritual whenever she could. The warmth, fleeting as it was, gave her a sense of being human in a world that demanded she be tireless, silent, and invisible. It was not luxury she sought, only the small dignity of caring for herself, with whatever means she could find. The kettle's leftover heat became a kind of private kindness, one she carved out from the rigid structure of the house. Washing her hair with the last heat of the tea kettle reveals how even the simplest comforts had to be claimed in stolen minutes, and with dangerous improvisation. Each gesture of care pulled her further into a world where survival depended on shaping necessity into quiet rituals. Before the morning fully began, she faced yet another secret task, drying her clothing in the oven's fading warmth to mask the fact that she had washed it under the cover of darkness. In the dim light of the early kitchen, long before the household stirred, a servant woman learned to read the smallest signals of her body. Among them, the cracking of her lips was one of the most persistent. Cold mornings, dry heat from the range, and hours spent speaking only when spoken to, left her mouth tight and painfully split at the corners. It was a discomfort too minor for anyone in the household to consider, yet sharp enough to bleed when she smiled or spoke. No balm or salve was provided downstairs. Such things belonged to dressing tables, not sculleries. So she turned again to what remained after meals, shaping necessity into a ritual meant only for those who lived with constant lack. Kitchen grease cooled and thickened after frying, becoming her only relief. The pan from the previous night often sat on the stove, waiting to be washed. At the bottom clung a thin layer of congealed fat, pale and slightly translucent. It carried the scent of whatever had been cooked that evening, a trace of salt, smoke, and meat. To the household upstairs, this residue was waste. To her, it was a remedy. She approached the pan only when she was certain no one stood nearby, glancing over her shoulder to ensure the housekeeper's steps were not approaching. She knew well that any act suggesting she used kitchen materials for personal care could be interpreted as indecency, even deceit. Their rules demanded she remain clean, but forbade her from seeking the tools that supported such cleanliness. She never touched the fat with her fingers. That would leave marks too easy to notice, too easy to question. Instead, she used a small object, a wooden skewer, the rounded handle of a spoon, or sometimes a short piece of bamboo, kept for turning small foods in the pan. She dipped the tip into the cooled fat, scooping up just enough to create a thin smear. The grease softened immediately with the warmth of her breath as she brought it closer to her mouth. She applied it with care, moving slowly along the cracked lines of her lips, feeling the sting ease as the fat melted into her skin. The sensation was humble, almost invisible, but to her it felt like reclaiming a part of her body, often forgotten beneath the demands of labor. The flavor lingered, not pleasant but familiar. It tasted of the kitchen itself, of meals she prepared but rarely enjoyed. Still, it protected her lips from splitting open during the day. When cold drafts rushed through the back hallway, or when the steam from boiling pots dried her skin further, the thin layer of grease shielded her from the pain that could flare with every word she spoke. It transformed an ordinary byproduct of cooking into something that allowed her to move through her tasks with a little more steadiness, a little less hurt. Yet the act remained dangerous. The housekeeper's gaze was sharp, trained to detect anything that hinted at impropriety. A servant using grease on her lips could be judged as unclean or even immoral, as though tending to her own discomfort somehow crossed an invisible boundary. Appearances mattered deeply within the household, and the women who worked below were expected to maintain themselves without showing how they achieved it. So she kept the ritual hidden, performing it quickly and wiping away any shine with her sleeve so that no one would see the faint glimmer on her mouth. After applying the grease, she always returned the utensil to its place, cleaning the tip with a quiet swipe against a piece of cloth. Her movements were practiced, careful, and entirely her own. No one noticed that the cloth she used bore a small streak of pale residue. No one questioned why the pan seemed slightly cleaner in the morning. These details blended seamlessly into the rhythm of the kitchen, disappearing into the background of constant work. If she had learned anything, it was how to carve acts of self-preservation from the spaces between chores, leaving no evidence behind. As the warmth from the stove slowly filled the room, she tested her lips again, pressing them together to feel whether the cracks had softened. The relief was modest, but meaningful. It allowed her to meet the long day with a slightly steadier expression, one that would not betray the rawness she felt every time she spoke. Such small comforts became anchors helping her endure the hours ahead when she would face orders, accusations, and endless tasks. She had no luxury of ointments or soft cloths, only the remnants of meals and a brief moment of privacy. This ritual, like so many others, reflected the ingenuity shaped by deprivation. She learned not only to survive within the narrow confines of the household, but to maintain her dignity through methods unknown to those who commanded her labor. The kitchen, meant to serve others, became the only place where she could tend to herself, and even then she had to do so quietly, as though caring for her own body was a secret that needed to be hidden. The remnant of tomorrow, softening her cracked lips with leftover kitchen grease, reveals how even the smallest comforts demanded secrecy in a world determined to deny her basic care. Each improvised gesture steadied her against the harshness that defined every corner of her day. As the demands of survival pressed further, she turned next to the warmth of discarded vegetable water, using it to soothe her aching feet before anyone could question the scent that clung faintly to her skin. Evening, in the Victorian kitchen, carried a heaviness that settled into every corner, a mixture of steam, fading warmth, and the long breath that came after the household had eaten. For the servant women, this hour did not mark the end of work, but the beginning of the quieter tasks that allowed them to repair their exhausted bodies. Their feet, swollen from hours of standing, bruised by stone floors and dried by winter air, throbbed beneath their worn stockings. No one upstairs ever considered the pain that built with each step. They expected the servants to move silently, efficiently, without hesitation. Yet the women below understood that their feet were the foundation of every task they performed. If they faltered, the entire rhythm of the house would falter with them. Among the few comforts available to them was the leftover water from boiling vegetables. After preparing carrots, turnips, or greens for supper, the pot held a warm, cloudy broth infused with salt and the faint sweetness of plant fibers. To the household, this water held no value. It was tipped casually toward the drain or left to cool before being thrown out. But to the servant women, who rarely had access to warm water for themselves, it was an opportunity shaped by timing, need, and secrecy. They learned to save a portion of it when no one watched too closely, pouring it quietly into a smaller basin or kettle, set aside from the washing supplies. The warmth of the vegetable water mattered more than its cleanliness. It softened the tight skin around their heels, easing the cracks that formed after days spent in stiff shoes and on soaked floors. When the kitchen finally emptied and the fire dimmed to a softer glow, a servant woman would draw the basin toward a corner where shadows fell deepest. Her movements remained cautious, even in solitude. Any unusual use of kitchen resources could be questioned, and her explanation would not be welcomed. She set the basin on the floor, dipped her hand into the water to test its temperature, and exhaled slowly, as the heat met her skin. Even if the warmth was faint, it was enough to begin loosening the ache that pulsed through her legs. She removed her shoes with care, easing her feet out slowly so the worn leather would not tear further. Her stockings peeled away stiffly, revealing skin reddened from friction and dryness. The cold air struck her feet first, making them throb with renewed severity, but the basin's warmth waited just inches away. She lowered her feet gradually, watching the water ripple as it embraced them. The mixture of salt and heat seeped into the cracks along her heels, the soreness easing little by little. She closed her eyes briefly, not in rest, but in concentration, allowing herself a moment to feel the relief without fear of interruption. Vegetable water carried a faint scent, an earthy mixture of cooked greens and starch. It clung lightly to her skin, but its benefits outweighed the risk of being asked why she smelled of the evening's meal. The warmth loosened the tightness in her arches and softened the hardened patches that made each step painful. Sometimes she rubbed her feet gently against the bottom of the basin, letting the water work deeper into the skin. Other times, she simply let them rest, knowing that even stillness was a luxury rarely afforded to her. When the water began to cool, she lifted her feet out, droplets tracing lines down her ankles. She reached for her apron, an old one frayed near the edges and marked with stains from countless meals. She used its cleanest corner to dry her feet, pressing the fabric between her toes and along her heels. The cloth scratched slightly, reminding her that nothing in her possession was meant for comfort. Still, it absorbed the water well enough, leaving her skin only slightly damp. She worked quickly, knowing the apron needed to be returned to its place without any sign it had served another purpose. Once her feet were dry, she slipped them back into her stockings, the fabric sliding more smoothly now that the skin beneath was softened. Rolling the stockings up her calves, she felt a small difference, a gentle ease where earlier there had been tightness and pain. She tucked her feet into her shoes again, feeling the fit settle around them with slightly less pressure. It was not comfort, only relief, but relief was enough to carry her into the next day's labor. This simple act of soaking her feet in discarded vegetable water revealed the ingenuity that shaped every part of her life. She found healing in what others threw away, turning waste into sustenance for her body. It required vigilance, secrecy, and an understanding that even her most basic needs must never interfere with the demands of the household. Yet she persisted, crafting moments of care from the narrowest margins of opportunity. Her survival depended on these rituals, small enough to hide, but powerful enough to steady her against the relentless pace of her work. Bathing her aching feet in leftover vegetable water shows how she built moments of relief from whatever scraps the household discarded. Each quiet ritual restored just enough strength to keep her moving through a life shaped by exhaustion and restraint. Before long, she would face an even sharper test of ingenuity, trimming her nails with a dulled kitchen knife that threatened to slice her skin as easily as it pared vegetables. As night finally settled deeply across the household and the last of her hidden routines came to completion, she would lie down on her narrow bed. The rituals of the day, the stolen soap, the leftover water, the ash, the grease, the cold stones, all of these would rest with her in the darkness. They were the threads that had held her together through another day, keeping her functional, keeping her dignified, keeping her human, Nobody upstairs would ever know the extent of what she had accomplished. Nobody would acknowledge the resourcefulness, the pain, the fear, or the quiet determination that had gone into every moment. But as you lie down now, I want you to carry something with you from this journey we've taken together tonight. The resilience of these women was extraordinary. In a world that denied them basic comfort and scrutinized their every move, they found ways to care for themselves. They transformed kitchen scraps into remedies. They used time stolen in heartbeats. They risked their positions for the dignity of cleanliness. And they did it all in silence, leaving no trace, asking nothing, expecting nothing. May you sleep well tonight, carrying the weight and the wonder of their stories with you. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope you'll return.